Hello, Midnight Wanderers, and welcome to Ashyrn Horror. This is where ancient whispers rise beneath a crimson sky, carrying you softly into the world of dreams and shadows. Before tonight's haunting story begins, tell me, what corner of the world are you listening from? Drop it in the comments. And if the silence of the night calls to you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you'll never miss the moon's next dark secret. This story didn't happen to me directly. Most of it took place years before I was even born, but it became one of those stories that was passed down through my family for as long as I can remember. Growing up, I heard bits and pieces of it from different relatives, and every time someone told it, it seemed to get a little stranger. The story centers around an old woman who lived next door to my grandmother. According to the people who lived in the neighborhood back then, she was a very mysterious person. She mostly kept to herself and didn't spend much time talking to her neighbors. In a small town where everybody knew everybody else's business, that alone was enough to make people suspicious. Over time, rumors began spreading about her. Some people claimed she practiced witchcraft. Others said she performed voodoo rituals. Some believed she could put curses on people. Whether any of those stories were actually true, nobody really knew. Most of the information came from gossip and local legends that had been passed around for years. Still, the rumors were strong enough that many people in town were genuinely afraid of her. The neighborhood children were especially fascinated by her. Kids would whisper stories about her whenever they passed her house. Some called her a witch. Others claimed strange things happened around her property. As with most childhood stories, nobody knew what was true and what wasn't. But fear has a way of growing when people keep feeding it. Eventually, the old woman became somewhat of a local legend. Then one day, everything changed. The woman was found dead inside her home. I don't know exactly how she died, only that the news spread quickly through the neighborhood. For most people, that should have been the end of the story. But according to my family, it was only the beginning. Not long before she passed away, the woman had given my mother a jewelry box. Nobody thought much of it at the time. It seemed like an ordinary gift, an old box filled with memories and small belongings. At first, everything seemed normal. Then strange things allegedly started happening. According to my family, the jewelry box would occasionally open by itself. Sometimes it would happen when nobody was near it. Other times it would happen in the middle of conversations. The lid would simply open without explanation. Whenever it happened, people would joke about the old woman. But underneath those jokes was genuine discomfort. The rumors surrounding her life had never completely disappeared, and now people were connecting every strange event to her memory. Years passed. Life moved on. Eventually, I was born. By then, the old woman's story had already become part of family history. The house she had lived in remained standing next to my grandmother's property. Even though years had gone by, people still talked about it. Some claimed the house felt different from the others. Some avoided walking near it after dark. Others dismissed the stories entirely. As a child, I didn't know what to believe. I simply listened. Over time, new people moved into the house. For a while, things would seem normal. Then something would happen. Sometimes a resident would move away unexpectedly. Other times, someone would pass away. Most of the deaths were probably explainable. Many of the people who moved into the house were older. Age alone could account for some of those tragedies. But in a neighborhood already filled with rumors, every death added another layer to the story. People began talking again. The old legends resurfaced. Some residents became convinced the house was cursed. Others believed the old woman was somehow still connected to the property. As the years went on, the stories only grew. Then, something happened that everyone in the neighborhood remembers. I was around 5 years old. One day, While we were outside, the house suddenly caught fire. The memory is still surprisingly clear in my mind. People started shouting. Neighbors rushed outside. Smoke filled the air. Everyone watched as flames spread through parts of the property. The strange thing was that nobody was inside. The house was empty. There was no obvious explanation for what had happened. As everyone focused on the fire, I remember looking toward the front yard. That's when I saw something. Or at least I think I did. Standing near the yard was what looked like a shadow. Not a detailed figure. Not someone I could clearly identify. Just a dark shape. For only a moment, I thought it resembled a person. A very still person. I blinked, looked again, and it was gone. At the time, I didn't tell anyone. I was only 5 years old. I assumed nobody would believe me. Even today, I don't know whether I actually saw something or whether my imagination filled in the details because I had already heard so many stories about the house. But the image stayed with me. As I got older, my fascination with the story only grew stronger. Part of me wanted to know whether any of the rumors were true. Part of me wanted to prove they weren't. Then there were the experiences I had whenever I visited my grandmother's house. The basement always made me uncomfortable. I can't explain exactly why. It wasn't particularly different from other basements. It was dark, quiet, and filled with storage boxes. Yet every time I went down there, I felt uneasy. Sometimes I thought I heard footsteps, not loud footsteps, just faint sounds that seemed to come from somewhere nearby. Other times, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. A shape, a figure, someone standing there for a split second. Whenever I looked directly, nothing was there. As a child, those experiences terrified me. I would run upstairs as quickly as possible. The basement became a place I tried to avoid whenever I could. The strange thing was that the experiences continued for years. Every time I visited my grandmother's house, I felt the same uneasiness. Every time I entered that basement, I found myself listening for sounds, watching shadows, expecting to see something. Sometimes I convinced myself it was all in my head. Other times, I wasn't so sure. Looking back now, there are probably many logical explanations. Old houses make noises, basements create strange echoes, childhood imaginations are incredibly powerful. Stories told by adults can influence how children interpret ordinary events. All of those explanations make sense. Yet despite understanding that, the memories remain. I still remember hearing stories about the old woman. I still remember learning about the jewelry box that supposedly opened on its own. I still remember hearing how residents came and went over the years. Most of all, I remember the day the abandoned house caught fire and the brief glimpse of a shadow standing in the yard. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was simply a trick of the light. Maybe years of hearing local legends had already planted ideas in my mind. But whenever I think about my grandmother's neighborhood, that's the image that returns first. An old house surrounded by stories, a fire burning in the daylight, and a dark figure standing silently in the yard before disappearing as quickly as it appeared. Whether any of it was truly connected to the old woman, I'll probably never know. But even now, whenever I visit old houses or hear stories about supposedly haunted places, I find myself remembering that neighborhood, that basement, and the strange legends that seemed to follow that house long after its original owner was gone. When I was around 11 years old, nighttime became something I genuinely feared. Not in the normal way kids are afraid of the dark or nervous after watching a scary movie, but in a deep, exhausting way that slowly took over my life. Every evening, as the sun started going down, I could feel anxiety building in my chest because I already knew what was coming later. I knew they would come again. Even now, years later, I still struggle to explain exactly what I saw during that period of my life. Part of me wants to dismiss it as childhood imagination mixed with fear and lack of sleep, but another part of me remembers how real everything felt at the time. It started gradually. At first, I would only catch strange shapes in the corners of my room late at night, small movements in the darkness. Quick glimpses of something standing near the closet or crouched beside the doorway. Whenever I turned my head directly toward them, they'd disappear or blend back into the shadows so perfectly that I'd convince myself I imagined it. But over time, the sightings became clearer and much more terrifying. My bedroom back then sat at the end of the hallway in our old house. During the daytime, it looked completely normal, maybe even comforting. I had posters on the walls, shelves full of toys and books, and a small lamp beside my bed that cast a warm glow across the room at night. But once the lights went out, everything changed. The darkness in that room always felt strangely thick, almost alive somehow. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls, and every small sound seemed amplified. The old house creaked constantly at night too, which only made things worse. That's when I started seeing them. The figures. At first they stayed near the corners of the room where the darkness was deepest. They didn't move much initially. They simply watched me. Small black shapes with glowing white eyes fixed directly on me from the shadows. I remember the eyes most clearly. Bright white, almost reflective, and completely unblinking. Whenever I noticed them, my body would instantly lock up with fear. I'd pull the blanket over myself, trying desperately not to look, but curiosity always forced me to peek again eventually. And every time, they were still there. Watching. Over the following weeks, the figures started getting closer. That's when the smiling began. Even now, describing those smiles makes my stomach tighten a little. They weren't normal smiles. Their mouths stretched unnaturally wide across dark, featureless faces, revealing rows of thin white teeth glowing faintly in the darkness. The smiles never changed. No matter what I did, they simply stood there grinning at me. I tried telling myself they weren't real, but fear doesn't listen to logic when you're a child alone in the dark. Every night became a battle just to fall asleep before they appeared. Sometimes I'd beg my parents to leave hallway lights on. Sometimes I pretended to be sick so I could sleep closer to them. But nothing truly helped, because no matter where I slept in that house, eventually I would wake up and see them again, standing silently nearby, watching me. Grinning, the strangest part was how still they usually remained. They rarely moved in obvious ways. Instead, it felt more like they slowly emerged from darkness itself. One moment, a corner of the room looked normal, and the next there would suddenly be a figure standing there that definitely hadn't been there seconds earlier. Sometimes I saw only one. Other nights there were several. I never understood what they wanted. They never spoke, never touched me. They just stared constantly with those horrible white eyes and impossibly wide smiles. The fear eventually became overwhelming. I stopped sleeping properly altogether. I'd stay awake for hours trying to avoid seeing them, but exhaustion always won eventually. Then I'd wake up sometime during the night and immediately feel them there again before even fully opening my eyes. My parents noticed something was wrong eventually. I became withdrawn, irritable, and constantly exhausted. Dark circles formed under my eyes from lack of sleep. They assumed I was just dealing with nightmares or stress, but I didn't fully know how to explain what was happening without sounding crazy. How do you tell adults that strange, smiling creatures crawl from the darkness every night to watch you sleep? I tried once. I remember explaining through tears that there were people in my room at night. My parents searched everywhere, trying to comfort me, showing me the closet was empty, checking under the bed, turning lights on and off. But of course, by then the figures were gone again. And honestly, part of me knew how impossible it sounded. Still, the fear never left. It got so bad at one point that I genuinely wanted to leave home forever. That sounds dramatic now, but as a child I felt trapped. The house itself started feeling poisoned somehow, like the darkness inside it belonged more to those things than to us. Nighttime became unbearable. I dreaded sunsets. I dreaded bedtime. I dreaded closing my eyes. The worst moments happened during those few seconds after waking up suddenly in the middle of the night. Before even moving, I would feel them there watching me from somewhere in the room. Then slowly I'd look around and see the eyes, sometimes close to the bed, sometimes near the ceiling corners, always smiling, always silent. Eventually something changed. I still don't know why. One night, they simply didn't appear. I remember lying awake nervously, expecting to see them emerge from the darkness as usual, but the room stayed empty all night. The next night passed the same way. Then another. Gradually, weeks went by without seeing them at all. At first, I didn't trust it. I kept expecting them to suddenly return stronger than before. But they never fully did. Not in that house. Later, my family eventually moved to a different home entirely. By then, I had mostly convinced myself maybe I'd simply grown out of whatever childhood fear or hallucination had caused those experiences. And honestly, for years afterward, life felt normal again. I slept peacefully. The fear faded. The figures became something distant and unreal, like strange memories from another version of my life. But every once in a while, even now as an adult, I still catch glimpses, usually late at night. Sometimes it's only for a split second out of the corner of my eye. A dark shape standing slightly too still in a hallway. A suggestion of white eyes near a doorway before blinking and realizing nothing is there. Other times it happens during moments when I'm extremely tired. I'll wake up briefly in darkness, and for one horrible instant think I see that familiar wide grin somewhere in the room before fully waking up. And every single time, that same cold fear returns immediately. Not because I necessarily believe those creatures were real, but because some part of me still remembers how real they felt when I was 11 years old, lying awake every night begging the darkness to leave me alone. Sometimes I wonder if they were simply nightmares created by stress and an overactive imagination. Childhood minds can do strange things, especially when fear and sleep deprivation feed each other night after night. But sometimes, during those rare moments when I catch a glimpse of something smiling from the corner of a dark room, I remember those glowing white eyes staring at me from the shadows. And for just a second, I feel 11 years old again. I've experienced quite a few things throughout my life that I would describe as strange or possibly paranormal, but one experience from my childhood has stayed with me more than any of the others. Even though more than a decade has passed since it happened, I still remember it clearly. Whenever I think back to that house, this is the memory that immediately comes to mind. At the time, I was around 9 or 10 years old. My family was living in a house that we would eventually move out of a year later. Looking back, there wasn't anything obviously unusual about the place. It looked like an ordinary family home from the outside, and during the day it felt completely normal. But nighttime was different. I had my own bedroom, which was something I had been excited about. Like most kids, I enjoyed having my own space where I could keep my toys, draw, play games, and do whatever interested me at the time. One thing I kept in my room was a large box that had originally belonged to a swing set. Instead of throwing it away, it had been stored underneath my bed. It wasn't something I thought about very often. It simply sat there collecting dust like countless other forgotten items children keep in their rooms. For a while, everything seemed normal. Then I started hearing noises. Almost every night, after everyone else in the house had gone to sleep, I would hear knocking sounds coming from underneath my bed. At first, I ignored it. Old houses make noises. Furniture shifts. Temperature changes can cause things to creak and pop. Even as a kid, I understood that not every strange sound meant something unusual. But these noises felt different. The knocks seemed to come directly from the box, not from the walls, not from the floor, not from somewhere else in the room, from the box. Every night, I would lie in bed, listening. Knock, knock, knock. Sometimes the sounds were soft. Other times, they were loud enough to make me sit up and stare into the darkness. The strange thing was that the noises almost always happened when I was trying to fall asleep. I remember pulling my blanket closer and listening carefully, trying to convince myself there was a logical explanation. Maybe something inside the box was shifting. Maybe it was expanding and contracting because of temperature changes. Maybe there was a mouse somewhere nearby. But no matter how many explanations I came up with, the knocking continued. As a child, it made me nervous. Not terrified, just uneasy. It was one of those things that sat in the back of my mind and became part of my nightly routine. Every evening I found myself wondering whether I would hear the knocking again. And almost every night, I did. Eventually, I got somewhat used to it. The noises became something I expected. Something strange, but familiar. Then, one night, something happened that made the entire experience much harder to explain. I was sitting in my room during the evening, playing around with a paint marker. I don't even remember exactly what I was drawing. Probably random doodles or designs the way kids often do. The room was quiet. Nothing unusual was happening. For once, I wasn't thinking about the sounds under my bed. I was completely focused on what I was doing. Then, I heard a voice. The memory is still vivid. The voice didn't sound like one of my parents. It didn't sound like a sibling. And it definitely didn't sound like it came from outside. It sounded close. Very close. Close enough that I immediately looked around the room. For a moment, I genuinely thought someone had entered without me noticing. But nobody was there. The voice said something that caught me completely off guard. It said it was protecting the marker. Even now, years later, those words seem strange. Out of all the things someone could have said, why mention a paint marker? Why that object? Why at that moment? The entire experience lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough to leave a lasting impression. I remember freezing, looking around, trying to figure out where the voice had come from. The room was empty. The hallway was empty. The house was quiet. Yet I was absolutely convinced I had heard something. For several minutes afterward, I sat there, staring around the room. Part of me wanted to tell someone. Another part of me worried that nobody would believe me. Eventually, I kept it to myself. The knocking continued after that. Not every single night, but often enough that I never completely forgot about it. There were times when I would lie awake listening for it. Sometimes it came, sometimes it didn't. But whenever it did, I immediately remembered the voice and the strange feeling that accompanied it. As time passed, life moved on. School became more important. Friends became more important. Childhood fears slowly faded. Then, about a year later, my family moved away. I still remember the timing because it happened toward the end of April. Packing up the house felt strange. Part of me was happy to leave. Another part felt nostalgic because it had been my home for several years. As moving day approached, I found myself thinking about all the odd things that had happened there. The knocking, the voice, the uneasy feeling that occasionally appeared when I was alone in my room. Once we left, something interesting happened. The experiences stopped. No more knocking, no more strange voices, no more unexplained events. Life became normal again, at least as normal as life can be. Years passed. Childhood slowly became adulthood. Today, I'm 21 years old. More than a decade separates me from that old bedroom. I've had plenty of time to think about what happened. I've considered every possible explanation I can imagine. Maybe the knocking really was caused by the box shifting underneath the bed. Maybe the voice was part of my imagination. Maybe I was tired and misheard something. Maybe my young mind interpreted ordinary sounds in an unusual way. All of those explanations are possible. In fact, they're probably the most likely explanations. Yet despite that, the memory remains surprisingly clear. What stays with me isn't necessarily the fear, it's the mystery. The simple fact that I never found out what caused those experiences. Even now, if I close my eyes, I can picture that room. I can see the box underneath the bed. I can remember lying awake in the darkness, waiting for the familiar knocking sounds to begin. And I can still hear that strange voice saying it was protecting the marker. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was childhood imagination mixed with a few unexplained noises. Or maybe it was something I'll never fully understand. Whatever the truth may be, it's one of those memories that never completely leaves you. The house is long gone from my life, but every now and then I still find myself thinking about those nights, listening to the knocking beneath my bed and wondering what, if anything, was really there. This happened when I was around 8 years old during a family vacation in Turkey. Looking back now, it might not seem like the most terrifying story ever told, but at the time it absolutely scared me and my friends. Even years later, I still remember the feeling of panic we experienced that night and the questions we were left with afterward. My family had booked a holiday at a large resort near the coast. Like many resorts, it was designed almost like a small town. There were several buildings, restaurants, pools, gardens, walking paths, and entertainment areas spread throughout the property. During the day, the place was full of activity. Families relaxed by the pool, children played games, and tourists wandered around enjoying their vacation. For me, the best part of the trip wasn't the swimming pools or the food. It was the friends I made. Within the first few days, I met 2 other boys around my age. We quickly became inseparable. Like most kids on vacation, we spent every day together, playing games, exploring the resort, and looking for ways to entertain ourselves. By the end of the trip, it felt like we'd known each other for years. One thing we especially enjoyed was taking walks around the resort in the evening. The property had a circular pathway that wrapped around much of the hotel grounds. During the daytime, it was used by guests going between different areas of the resort. At night, however, it became much quieter. We loved walking those paths. It made us feel older and more independent. Of course, looking back now, we were just 3 kids wandering around a hotel after dark. But at 8 years old, it felt like an adventure. One particular evening started like any other. The weather was warm, and most guests were either eating dinner, watching entertainment shows, or relaxing in their rooms. The 3 of us decided to take another walk around the circular path. We joked around, talked about random things, and challenged each other to see who could complete the most laps around the resort. Everything felt completely normal. As we continued walking, we eventually reached a quieter section of the property. This area wasn't visited very often by guests. There were fewer lights, fewer people, and fewer reasons for tourists to be there. That's when we noticed a small hut. I had seen it before during the day, but never paid much attention to it. From what we understood, it was some kind of security or monitoring station where staff members occasionally checked surveillance cameras around the resort. At least, that's what we believed at the time. The building wasn't particularly large. It looked more like a small utility hut than an actual office. Normally, nobody paid attention to it. But that night, something immediately caught our attention. The door was open. Inside sat a man. At first, we assumed he was a member of the hotel staff, but the longer we looked, the stranger he seemed. He wasn't wearing the standard hotel uniform. Every employee we had seen during our vacation wore clothing that clearly identified them as staff. This man wasn't dressed like any employee we had encountered. Instead, he was wearing a plain white t-shirt and shorts. What stood out most, however, were the stains. Scattered across parts of his shirt and shorts were small red marks. At first, I thought it might have been paint. But even from a distance, the stains looked unsettling. The three of us immediately became curious. Kids naturally want to investigate things they don't understand. So instead of walking away, we moved a little closer. The hut's door was open wide enough for us to see inside. We cautiously peeked through the entrance. The man was sitting in a chair. For a few moments, he didn't appear to notice us. Then, suddenly, he turned his head. Our eyes met. The atmosphere changed instantly. The man slowly stood up from his chair. Every one of us immediately felt uncomfortable. There wasn't anything obviously threatening about him. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't acting aggressively. Yet something about his appearance and the situation felt wrong. He looked directly at us. Then he started walking toward the door. My stomach immediately tightened. As he approached, he asked us a question. "What are you kids doing up here this late?" The words themselves weren't threatening. In fact, under normal circumstances, they might have sounded perfectly reasonable. But something about the way he said them made us nervous. Maybe it was his tone. Maybe it was his appearance. Maybe it was simply because we were young children alone at night. Whatever the reason, every instinct told us the same thing. Leave now. The moment he stepped closer, panic took over. None of us waited for another question. None of us stayed around to explain ourselves. We turned and ran, as fast as we possibly could. I still remember the sound of our footsteps pounding against the path as we sprinted back toward the main hotel building. None of us looked behind us. We didn't want to know whether the man was following us. We just wanted to get somewhere crowded and safe. After what felt like forever, we finally reached the lobby area. The bright lights and presence of other guests immediately made us feel better. Breathing heavily, we rushed over to the front desk staff and explained what had happened. At first, I think they assumed we were simply frightened children who had imagined something. But as we continued describing the man and his strange appearance, the employees became noticeably more serious. Several staff members exchanged looks. Then, one of them asked us to describe exactly where we had seen him. After we explained the location, something unexpected happened. The staff looked confused. One employee told us something that immediately caught our attention. According to him, that hut wasn't actively being used anymore. In fact, it was usually kept locked. The building wasn't supposed to be occupied. That revelation made the situation even stranger. If the hut wasn't in use, who had we seen inside? A few staff members immediately went to investigate. We stayed in the lobby while they checked the area. The wait felt endless. Part of me hoped they would find the man. At least then we'd know we hadn't imagined him. Eventually, the employees returned, and what they told us only deepened the mystery. They found nobody. The hut was empty. No sign of the man. No indication that anyone had recently been sitting there. Nothing. At least, almost nothing. According to the staff, they did find small red droplets inside. The same red marks we had noticed on the man's clothing. At first, nobody knew what they were. Later, we were told the droplets appeared to be blood. That information sent chills through all of us. The staff never gave us much more information after that. Whether they investigated further, I honestly don't know. As children, we weren't exactly included in whatever happened afterward. All we knew was that the mysterious man was gone. The hut was empty, and traces of blood had apparently been left behind. The rest of the vacation passed without incident. We never saw the man again, we never returned to that area at night, and we definitely never looked at that hut the same way again. Years later, I've tried to come up with explanations. Maybe the man wasn't dangerous at all. Perhaps he was an injured worker or someone trespassing on the property. Maybe he had cut himself and left before security arrived. Maybe there was a perfectly ordinary explanation that we simply never learned. That's entirely possible. In fact, it's probably the most likely explanation. But when you're 8 years old, logic doesn't always win. What stays with you is the feeling, the image, the memory. I still remember seeing the strange man sitting alone inside that abandoned hut. I remember the red stains on his clothing. I remember him standing up and walking toward us. Most of all, I remember the fear that hit all three of us at exactly the same moment. Even now, whenever I think about childhood vacations, that night always comes back to me. Out of all the pools, beaches, games, and happy memories from that trip, the one thing that never faded was the image of that mysterious man sitting inside a building that wasn't supposed to be occupied, staring at three curious kids before disappearing without a trace. To this day, I still wonder who he was, why he was there, and where he went before the hotel staff arrived. And honestly, I'm not sure I really want to know the answer. When I was around 6 years old, my mom and I experienced something that still makes me uneasy whenever I think about it. Looking back now, it's one of those situations that could have ended very differently, and the older I get, the more I realize just how frightening it must have been for my mother. At the time, it felt like an adventure. As a child, I didn't fully understand the danger we were in. I could sense that something was wrong, but I didn't have the life experience to appreciate just how vulnerable we really were that night. The story took place when my mom and I were driving home from downtown Philadelphia to our house in Media, Pennsylvania. It was late in the evening, and we'd been on the road for a while. Like many kids, I was tired and half paying attention to the world outside the window. My mom was driving a 1997 Ford Explorer that had definitely seen better days. The vehicle was old, it was worn down, and it had more than a few problems. One of those problems was particularly concerning. The doors didn't lock. Normally, that was just an inconvenience. On that night, it became something much more serious. As we traveled along Interstate 95 and passed through Chester, the Explorer decided it had had enough. Without warning, the vehicle broke down. My mom managed to guide it safely onto the shoulder of the highway, but it quickly became obvious that we weren't going anywhere. The engine refused to cooperate. The car was dead, and we were stranded. To make matters worse, this was before roadside assistance was as common and accessible as it is today. My dad was away on a work trip more than 100 miles from home. There wasn't anyone nearby who could immediately come help us. For the moment, we were completely on our own. My mom grabbed her phone and called a tow company. After explaining our location, she was told a truck could come, but it would take about an hour. An hour. At the time, that sounded manageable. Neither of us knew how long that hour would eventually feel. At first, we simply waited. Cars rushed by on the highway. Headlights flashed past in the darkness. The night felt quiet despite the traffic. For about 15 minutes, nothing unusual happened. Then a van appeared. It was an older white van, the kind that already looks unsettling before anything suspicious even happens. The vehicle slowly pulled onto the shoulder behind us. Then something strange happened. The driver turned off his headlights. The van sat there in darkness. At first, my mom wasn't overly concerned. People occasionally stopped to help stranded motorists. Maybe he was checking if we needed assistance. Maybe he was waiting for someone. Maybe there was a perfectly innocent explanation. Several minutes passed. The van didn't move. The driver didn't get out. Nobody approached our vehicle. The man simply sat there, waiting, watching. My mom occasionally glanced into the rear-view mirror. Each time she did, she noticed the same thing. The driver was staring directly at our vehicle, not looking around, not checking his phone, not talking to anyone, just staring. As the minutes stretched on, the situation became harder to ignore. 5 minutes passed. 10 minutes passed. 15 minutes passed. The van remained exactly where it was. The driver remained exactly where he was. Still watching. Still staring. By this point, my mom's concern had turned into genuine fear. We were sitting on the side of a highway at around 10:45 at night. We were in an area she wasn't comfortable being stranded in. Our car doors didn't. She was alone with a 6-year-old child, and a stranger had been watching us for nearly half an hour. The situation didn't feel right. Trusting her instincts, my mom called the police. She explained where we were and described the man in the van. The dispatcher listened carefully and told her to remain inside the vehicle. An officer would be sent as soon as possible. The words provided some reassurance, but they didn't solve the immediate problem. We were still sitting there, and the man was still watching. I didn't understand everything that was happening, but I could hear the tension in my mother's voice. She was trying to stay calm, trying not to scare me, trying to think clearly. Then she turned toward me and gave me instructions I'll never forget. She told me to get down and hide underneath the seat. At first, I didn't understand why, but something in her tone told me not to argue. She wasn't asking. She was telling me. Even as a young child, I could sense that she was frightened, and if my mom was scared, then I knew the situation was serious. Without saying much, I slid down and curled up beneath the seat. From my hiding spot, I could still hear everything happening around us. The passing traffic, the occasional sound of engines, and the silence from the van behind us. Several more minutes passed. Then things got worse. The van's engine started. For a brief moment, my mom probably hoped the driver was finally leaving. Instead, the van slowly pulled forward. Then it stopped directly beside our vehicle. The driver shut off the engine again. Now he wasn't behind us anymore. He was next to us. Close enough that he could see directly into the car. Close enough that if he wanted to approach, it would only take a few seconds. The van was positioned in a way that partially blocked us, and once again the man simply sat there, watching, staring, not saying anything, not leaving, just looking at my mother. The image she later described still sends chills down my spine. A stranger, sitting silently in a dark van late at night, staring through the window of a disabled vehicle occupied by a woman and a child. At that moment, my mom was terrified. She later admitted that her mind immediately began considering worst-case scenarios. The doors didn't lock. We were stranded. The police hadn't arrived yet, and she had no idea what this man's intentions were. The uncertainty was the scariest part. If he had approached immediately, she would have known what she was dealing with. Instead, he simply waited, and that waiting made everything worse. A few more minutes passed. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, something changed. Without warning, the man started his van. The engine roared to life. The vehicle pulled away from the shoulder, and within seconds he was gone. No explanation, no interaction, no words. He simply disappeared into the night. My mom sat there, stunned, relieved, confused, still frightened, and still wondering what had just happened. Only a few minutes later, flashing lights appeared in the distance. The police had arrived. An officer pulled over and spoke with my mother. After hearing the story, he remained with us until the tow truck eventually arrived. For the rest of the night, knowing a police officer was nearby brought a tremendous sense of relief. Eventually, the tow truck came. Our vehicle was removed, and we finally made it home safely. That should have been the end of the story. But even now, years later, the questions remain. What was that man doing? Why did he stop behind us? Why did he sit there for roughly 40 minutes without leaving? Why did he move his van next to ours? And perhaps most importantly, why did he leave just before the police arrived? Maybe there was an innocent explanation. Maybe he really was considering whether to help. Maybe he was dealing with his own problems. Maybe the entire situation was one big misunderstanding. Those possibilities exist. But when I think about the way my mother described his stare, the amount of time he spent watching us, and the fact that he moved closer instead of leaving, it's difficult not to wonder. As a child, I mostly remember being confused. As an adult, I understand something very different. I understand how vulnerable my mother must have felt sitting there alone. I understand why she told me to hide. I understand why she called the police. And I understand how lucky we were that nothing happened. To this day, whenever I drive past a stranded vehicle on the side of the road at night, I think about that experience. I think about the broken down Explorer. I think about the dark shoulder of the highway. I think about the white van. And I think about the fact that sometimes the scariest encounters aren't the ones where something happens. They're the ones where you never find out what almost happened. And that's exactly what still haunts me about that night. When I was 12 years old, my parents and I were living in a house that, at the time, seemed completely normal. It wasn't particularly old, and there was nothing about it that made us think anything unusual had ever happened there. We had lived there for a while without experiencing anything strange, and none of us really believed in ghosts or paranormal activity. In fact, whenever people talked about haunted houses or supernatural experiences, we were usually the first ones to dismiss those stories. We always assumed there was a logical explanation for everything. That belief was challenged one evening. It started on what seemed like an ordinary day. My parents and I were sitting together in the living room. We were relaxing, watching television, and talking about random things. It was a quiet evening, and nothing unusual had happened throughout the day. Then, without warning, we heard a loud crash coming from the kitchen. The sound was so sudden that it immediately got everyone's attention. For a moment, nobody moved. We all looked at each other. Then, my dad stood up and headed toward the kitchen, while my mom and I followed behind him. The moment we walked into the room, we saw a cup lying on the floor. It had fallen from the table and shattered into pieces. At first, we tried to explain it logically. Maybe it had been sitting too close to the edge. Maybe someone had accidentally bumped the table earlier without realizing it. Maybe vibrations from walking through the house had slowly caused it to move. Those explanations seemed reasonable enough. Still, something felt strange. The cup hadn't been near the edge when we last saw it, and none of us remembered touching the table. For a few minutes, we stood there discussing it. Eventually, we cleaned up the broken glass and returned to the living room. Even though we joked about ghosts afterward, none of us genuinely believed that was the explanation. We simply moved on with our evening. The rest of the night was quiet. No strange noises, no unusual events. Nothing else happened. Eventually, we all went to bed. At that point, the broken cup was already becoming one of those weird little incidents families laugh about and forget. Unfortunately, the next morning changed everything. I woke up suddenly. The room felt strangely quiet. At first I wasn't sure why I had awakened. Then I looked at the clock. It was around 4:12 in the morning. I remember the time because seeing it made me wonder why I was awake so early. As I sat there trying to wake up, I heard movement elsewhere in the house. A few moments later, my parents were awake too. Something felt wrong. We all stepped out of our rooms and made our way toward the main part of the house. The moment we arrived, we stopped in shock. Items were scattered across the floor. Objects that had been sitting normally the night before were now lying broken and overturned. Several things had somehow ended up on the ground. Glass pieces were scattered across parts of the room. Decorations had fallen. Other household items appeared to have been knocked over. The scene looked as though someone had gone through the house during the night and swept things off shelves and tables. For several moments, none of us said a word. We simply stared. The sight didn't make any sense. Nobody else had been inside the house. The doors were still locked. The windows appeared untouched. Yet things that had been perfectly fine only hours earlier were now broken across the floor. I remember feeling a knot form in my stomach. The broken cup from the previous evening suddenly didn't seem so insignificant anymore. My parents looked just as confused as I was. We immediately began trying to figure out what could have happened. Maybe there had been some kind of vibration. Maybe a shelf had collapsed. Maybe there was another explanation we weren't seeing. But the more we looked around, the harder it became to understand. The fallen objects weren't all in one location. They were scattered in different areas. It didn't seem like a single shelf or table had simply broken. It looked random, and that randomness was what made it unsettling. The atmosphere inside the house suddenly felt different. The place no longer felt comfortable. Instead of trying to stay and figure everything out, we decided to leave for a while. We stepped outside and discussed what to do next. Eventually, my parents decided to contact the owner of the property. They explained what had happened and asked if there was anything about the house we should know. At first, the owner seemed hesitant. Then he finally told us something he had never mentioned before. According to him, his grandmother had died inside that house years earlier. The moment he said those words, everything became very quiet. None of us knew how to respond. It wasn't necessarily proof that anything supernatural had happened. People pass away in houses all the time. That fact alone doesn't mean a place is haunted. Still, learning that information after everything we had experienced felt unsettling. What bothered us most wasn't the fact that someone had died there, it was that the owner had never told us. For all the time we had lived in the house, we had no idea. Now, suddenly, we were hearing about a death that had occurred inside the very home where we had experienced those strange events. The owner insisted that nothing unusual had ever happened before. At least, not that he knew of. But after hearing his story, it became impossible not to think about the timing. First, the cup falling by itself. Then the strange destruction we found at 4:12 in the morning. And only afterward did we learn about his grandmother. Whether the events were connected or not, I honestly can't say. Looking back now, there could have been completely ordinary explanations. Maybe the cup really did fall accidentally. Maybe some of the other objects were already unstable and happened to fall during the night. Maybe there were factors we never considered. Those possibilities certainly exist. But when you're 12 years old and standing in a house filled with broken objects before sunrise, logic doesn't always come first. What stays with you is the feeling, the confusion, the questions, and the realization that something happened that nobody could fully explain. Years have passed since then, but I still remember that night clearly. I remember sitting in the living room with my parents when we heard the crash from the kitchen. I remember seeing the shattered cup on the floor. I remember waking up at 4:12 in the morning and finding things broken, throughout the house. Most of all, I remember the conversation with the owner and learning about his grandmother's death for the very first time. Maybe it was all a coincidence. Maybe it wasn't. Either way, it remains one of the strangest experiences my family and I have ever shared, and it's a memory I don't think I'll ever completely forget. I have never told many people about this experience, and even today I still remember it clearly. I was only 5 years old when it happened. At that age, I was a very innocent and somewhat foolish child who believed almost everything adults told me. One day, my mother wanted me to focus on my studies. She told me that if I spent the entire day studying, I would be free to play as much as I wanted afterward. To a 5-year-old, that sounded like a great deal. I agreed immediately and spent the whole day trying my best to do exactly what she had asked. As the hours passed, I kept thinking about the moment when I would finally be allowed to play. I was excited and impatient. Looking back now, I realize that most children would have gotten tired or forgotten about the promise, but I took it very seriously. By the time I finished, it was incredibly late. In fact, it was around 3 o'clock in the morning. Being so young, I didn't really understand how unusual that was. All I knew was that I had kept my promise, and now it was time for my reward. I went to my mother's room and woke her up. I told her that I had studied all day and wanted to go play in the park. The park was located directly below our apartment building, inside the housing society where we lived. My mother was exhausted and half asleep. She barely opened her eyes before telling me that if I wanted to play, I could go by myself because the park was right there and she was too tired to come with me. Without thinking twice, I happily left the apartment and headed downstairs. The housing society where we lived was generally peaceful. There were apartment buildings surrounding a small park where children would gather during the day. However, there was something unusual about the location. Right beside the park was a graveyard. The graveyard was hidden behind many large trees. The trees were so thick and closely packed together that children playing in the park could not normally see inside. During the daytime, it didn't seem particularly scary. It was simply another part of the neighborhood that nobody paid much attention to. At 3 in the morning, however, everything felt different. The park was completely empty. There were no children laughing, no parents talking, and no sounds of people walking around. The entire area was silent. I remember the cool night air brushing against my skin as I walked toward the playground equipment. Then I noticed something new. A new swing had recently been installed in the park. Being a child, I immediately forgot about everything else and ran toward it. I sat down and began swinging back and forth. At first, I was having a wonderful time. The chains creaked softly as I moved through the darkness. I felt proud of myself for studying all day and finally getting to enjoy my reward. For several minutes, nothing seemed strange. Then a feeling came over me. It is difficult to describe exactly what it felt like. Even now, years later, I remember it clearly. It was the sudden feeling that someone was watching me. At first, I ignored it. I looked around the park, expecting to see another resident or perhaps a security guard. But nobody was there. The swings continued moving. The silence seemed heavier than before. That uncomfortable feeling grew stronger. I felt as if a pair of eyes were fixed directly on me. Slowly, I turned my head toward the graveyard. The trees stood motionless in the darkness. For a moment, I saw nothing. Then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was a girl sitting on one of the trees. To this day, I cannot explain how she was sitting there. She wasn't standing beside the tree or hiding behind it. She appeared to be perched among the branches, staring directly at me. The moment I saw her, fear rushed through my entire body. There was something horribly wrong with her face. It looked as though it had been covered in deep cuts from every angle. Marks and wounds stretched across her skin in ways that seemed impossible. Her appearance was unlike anything I had ever seen before. One of her eyes was missing. It looked as if it had been completely destroyed. The other eye was even worse. It was entirely white. There was no visible pupil, no color, nothing, just a pale white eye that seemed to glow in the darkness. I froze, I couldn't move, I couldn't scream, I couldn't even look away. The girl continued staring at me from the tree. The night suddenly felt colder. Every instinct inside me told me that something was terribly wrong. Then she spoke. She called my name. I still remember the shock that ran through me at that moment. I had never seen her before. I had no idea who she was. Yet somehow, she knew exactly who I was. Hearing my name come from that terrifying figure was more frightening than her appearance itself. My heart began pounding so hard that it felt like it would burst from my chest. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream for my mother. I wanted to do anything except stay there. But fear had completely taken control of me. The last thing I remember is staring at that glowing white eye while she called my name. Then everything went black. When I opened my eyes again, it was morning. Sunlight was shining above me. For a few moments, I was confused and didn't understand where I was. Then I realized I was still in the park. I sat up slowly, trying to understand what had happened. Soon I learned that my parents had woken up and discovered that I was not in my room. At first, they assumed I was somewhere inside the apartment. When they couldn't find me, they became worried and started searching for me. Eventually, they found me lying in the park. I remember trying desperately to explain everything to them. I told them about the girl. I told them about the graveyard. I told them about the cuts on her face. I told them about the missing eye and the glowing white one. I told them how she had called my name before I passed out, but my parents didn't believe me. They thought I had simply made the entire story up. From their perspective, I was just a 5-year-old child with an overactive imagination. They assumed I was creating an excuse for being outside in the middle of the night. No matter how many times I repeated the story, they wouldn't take it seriously. Eventually, I stopped trying to convince them. Years have passed since that night. I have often wondered what I really saw. Maybe it was a dream. Maybe my imagination created something terrifying out of the shadows. Or maybe it was something I still cannot explain. What makes the memory stay with me is not just the appearance of the girl. It is the fact that she knew my name. I had never seen her before. There was nobody else in the park. Yet she called me as if she had known me all my life. Even now, whenever I think about that night, I can picture the empty playground, the dark trees surrounding the graveyard, and that pale, glowing eye staring directly at me from the darkness. I never saw the girl again. I never heard her voice again. But the memory has remained with me ever since. For years, I kept this story to myself because I knew most people would react the same way my parents did. They would assume it was just the imagination of a frightened child. Maybe they are right. Maybe there is a perfectly logical explanation for what happened that night. But whenever I remember the feeling of being watched, the sight of that figure sitting in the tree, and the sound of my own name being called from the darkness, I cannot help wondering whether what I saw was real. Whatever the truth may be, it remains one of the most terrifying experiences of my childhood, and it is something I will never forget. This happened during my senior year of high school, while I was working at Burger King. Even now, decades later, it remains one of the strangest and most unsettling experiences of my life. I've told very few people about it over the years because every time I revisit the memory, I still get the same uneasy feeling I had that night. The event took place sometime in the spring of 1993. Back then, I worked a lot of late shifts on Friday and Saturday nights. The drive-through stayed open until 1 a.m., so closing duties often kept us there well after midnight. Most nights, I ended up being one of the last employees in the building. Because I was a young woman leaving work alone late at night, my manager, Eric, had developed a routine. Whenever my shift ended, he would walk me to the front door, watch me cross the parking lot, wait until I got safely into my car, and only then would he lock the building and return inside. It was a small gesture, but one I appreciated. The area wasn't exactly dangerous, but being alone in a dark parking lot after midnight wasn't something anyone looked forward to. On the night this happened, however, things were a little different. Eric was running behind. When we finished closing, he seemed stressed and in a hurry. He told me he still had paperwork to complete and needed to leave as soon as possible because he had plans afterward. As we walked toward the front entrance, he asked me if I would mind if he skipped the usual routine. Instead of standing there watching me walk all the way to my car, could he simply lock the door and head straight back to his office? I didn't think twice about it. That's fine, I told him. After all, I was 18 years old. I wasn't worried about walking across a parking lot by myself. At least, not until that night. Eric opened the door for me, and I stepped outside. I called back, "Good night." He answered, then immediately locked the door behind me. I glanced over my shoulder and saw him jogging back through the restaurant toward his office. That was the last time I saw another person for quite a while. Like most employees, I parked far away from the entrance. The closer spots were reserved for customers, so workers usually left their vehicles at the edge of the lot. That meant I had a decent walk ahead of me. The night was quiet. The parking lot lights had already been turned off. Only a few distant streetlights and surrounding businesses provided illumination. I had been walking for maybe 20 seconds when I heard a strange sound. At first, it reminded me of a plastic grocery bag fluttering in the wind. A light rustling sound. Nothing alarming. I immediately assumed someone had forgotten to throw away a piece of trash and it was blowing across the property. Without really thinking about it, I turned around and looked toward the restaurant. Nothing. No bag, no debris, no obvious source of the sound. I shrugged and continued walking. Then I heard it again. The same rustling noise. This time, I stopped, completely. Something about it seemed odd. I slowly looked upward. That's when I saw it. At first, I honestly thought it was exactly what I had imagined. A large, black trash bag. It appeared to be caught on the roof of the building and was moving slightly in the wind. That explanation made perfect sense for about 2 seconds. Then I really looked at it. The longer I stared, the stranger it became. The shape wasn't random. It wasn't folded or tangled the way a plastic bag would be. Instead, it looked almost human. I remember standing there, trying to figure out what I was seeing. Maybe there was an antenna on the roof, maybe a maintenance structure, maybe some sort of pipe or equipment housing. Anything that could explain why a large piece of plastic appeared suspended above the building. But I couldn't think of anything. The Burger King roof was flat. There wasn't anything sticking up that could account for it. Yet there it was. Dark, motionless, watching the object, looked almost as though a person was standing there covered entirely in a thin black plastic sheet. The material moved gently in the wind, creating that rustling sound I had heard moments earlier. I tried to see its legs. Nothing. I looked for support beams. Nothing. I looked for any physical object connecting it to the roof. Nothing. And that's when the realization hit me. I could see light underneath it. Not partially. Completely. There was visible light passing beneath whatever this thing was. The Burger King sat in front of a large car dealership. and the dealership was brightly illuminated even after midnight. The powerful white lights behind the building created a backlit effect. That's why I could see the silhouette so clearly. And because of those lights, I could also see beneath it. There were no legs, no structure, no visible support, just darkness hanging above the roofline. The sight immediately sent a chill through me. The feeling wasn't ordinary fear, it was something deeper. An instinctive warning, the overwhelming sensation that I was being watched. Every hair on my arms stood up, my stomach tightened, and for reasons I still can't fully explain, I felt as though I should not take my eyes off it. I stood frozen for several seconds. Part of me desperately wanted a logical explanation. Maybe I was tired. Maybe the lighting was creating an illusion. Maybe there was something obvious I wasn't seeing. To reassure myself, I briefly looked away. I glanced toward the restaurant entrance. Part of me hoped Eric would suddenly appear. Maybe he'd walk outside and see the same thing. Maybe he'd explain what it was. But the doorway remained empty. The restaurant was silent. The road nearby had little traffic. And I was alone. The moment I looked back up, the shape was still there. Watching, at least, that's what it felt like. I made a decision. I was leaving. Immediately, but I still couldn't bring myself to turn my back on it. Instead, I began walking backward toward my car. Slowly, carefully, never breaking eye contact. Every step felt awkward. Every second felt longer than it should have. I finally reached my car, a 1987 Dodge Omni. This was long before keyless entry and remote unlock systems. I had to physically insert my key into the lock. Normally, it was a routine task. That night, it felt impossible. My hands were shaking. I kept my eyes fixed on the figure while fumbling for the key. Eventually, the door unlocked. I climbed inside, started the engine, and drove away. The entire time, I continued watching it. Even as the building grew smaller in my rear-view mirror, I couldn't stop looking. I was terrified that if I looked away, something would happen. The drive home felt endless. A strange feeling settled over me. I became convinced that whatever I had seen was somehow following me. I know how irrational that sounds, but fear isn't always rational. I kept glancing into the sky. I don't know why. Maybe because whatever I saw seemed impossible. Maybe because I couldn't understand how it was standing there. Part of me wondered if it could move, if it could fly, if it was somehow coming after me. The thoughts raced through my mind the entire drive home. When I finally reached my house, I didn't waste a second. I pulled into the driveway, jumped out of the car, and ran to the front door. The moment I got inside, I locked it. Then I stood there, watching, waiting. My family was asleep. The house was quiet. Yet I remained at the door for several minutes, peering outside and making sure nothing had followed me. Eventually, exhaustion won. But the memory stayed. For years, I barely mentioned the experience. Every time I thought about it, I got the same uneasy feeling. It wasn't until much later that I finally told some family members. One conversation in particular has always stuck with me. A cousin of mine who was deeply interested in spiritual practices and what she referred to as white magic listened carefully as I described everything. When I finished, she became very serious. She asked whether there had ever been someone obsessed with me, someone who wouldn't leave me alone, someone who wanted a relationship I had repeatedly rejected. Immediately, another memory came flooding back. During my time at Burger King, there had been a man who regularly visited the restaurant. I was 18. He appeared to be in his 30s. At first, he seemed harmless. He would buy a tea, sit in the dining room for hours, and repeatedly get free refills. Employees quickly became familiar with him. Then his behavior changed. He started asking for my phone number. Repeatedly, when I refused, he kept asking. Then he started insisting. Eventually, management had to intervene several times. The situation escalated to the point where police were involved and he was banned from the restaurant. After that, he disappeared, or so I thought. When I told my cousin about him, she immediately connected him to what I had seen. According to her beliefs, the figure on the roof wasn't a random occurrence. She believed it was connected to him somehow. That explanation may sound unbelievable to some people. Honestly, I don't know what to believe myself. But hearing it made me deeply uncomfortable. The only thing I know for certain is that whatever I saw that night felt wrong. Deeply wrong. And despite all the years that have passed, I still remember every detail. The dark parking lot, the rustling sound, the bright lights from the dealership, the impossible silhouette, the feeling of being watched. Years later, when I watched the movie Jeepers Creepers, I experienced a moment of déjà vu. The creature in the film wasn't identical to what I had seen, but it reminded me of it. Imagine that figure covered entirely by a thin black plastic sheet moving in the wind. That's the closest comparison I've ever found. Maybe there was a rational explanation. Maybe there wasn't. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that I've never forgotten it. And even now, decades later, I still occasionally find myself wondering what exactly was standing on that roof, watching me at 1:30 in the morning. This is one of those experiences that still feels strange to think about, even years later. Looking back, it's scary to realize how close I may have come to something much worse without even knowing it. I was 12 years old, and summer had just started. School was finally out, and I was excited to enjoy the break. Like most kids my age, I was focused on having fun, hanging out with friends, and making the most of the long summer days. The last thing on my mind was anything related to hospitals or serious health problems. Around that time, I started noticing a strange pain in my back. It wasn't unbearable, but it was definitely there. At first, I didn't think much of it. I assumed I had slept in a weird position, pulled a muscle, or maybe hurt myself while playing outside. It seemed like the kind of thing that would go away on its own if I just ignored it for a few days. The pain stayed with me, though. Day after day, it continued. Some days it felt a little better, while other days it was more noticeable. Even then, I wasn't too concerned. I was young and healthy, and I figured my body would eventually sort itself out. I never imagined it could be a sign of something serious. What made the situation even more confusing was that I didn't have any of the symptoms people usually associate with being sick. I didn't have a fever. I wasn't coughing. I didn't feel exhausted. I wasn't showing any obvious signs that something dangerous was happening inside my body. All I had was that persistent back pain. Because of that, neither I nor the people around me had much reason to think there was a major problem. Life continued as normal. I tried to enjoy my summer while simply putting up with the discomfort. Then, everything changed. One day, I suddenly started throwing up. Not just once or twice, either. It was severe and relentless. The vomiting came out of nowhere and hit me hard. Before long, it became clear that this wasn't a simple stomach bug or something I had eaten. I felt awful. My parents became concerned almost immediately. Seeing how sick I was, they decided I needed medical attention right away. Looking back now, that decision may have saved my life. When we arrived at the hospital, The doctors began running tests to figure out what was wrong. At that point, I still had no idea what was happening. I assumed they would tell me I had some kind of virus and send me home after a few hours. Instead, the doctors discovered something much more serious. I had a kidney infection. I remember being shocked when they told us. Kidney infections were something I had never even thought about before. I certainly didn't know enough about them to recognize the warning signs. What surprised the doctors even more was the fact that I hadn't shown many of the typical symptoms. The only real warning sign I had experienced beforehand was the back pain that I had been ignoring for days. That pain wasn't a pulled muscle. It wasn't a minor injury. It was my body trying to tell me that something was seriously wrong. By the time I arrived at the hospital, the infection had become extremely dangerous. The doctors explained that my condition was much worse than any of us had realized. What I had assumed was a minor problem had actually been growing more severe every day. I later learned that I had arrived at the hospital just in time. The infection had progressed to the point where my health was in serious danger. Hearing that afterward was terrifying because, at the time, I had no idea how close things had come to a different outcome. Instead of going home after a few hours, I ended up being admitted to the hospital. I stayed there for 2 weeks. For a 12-year-old kid expecting to spend the summer having fun, it was a huge adjustment. Hospital rooms replaced summer activities. Doctors and nurses became part of my daily routine. There were tests, medications, treatments, and long days spent recovering. At first, I didn't fully understand how serious everything had been. I was mostly focused on getting better and going home. As time passed, though, the reality of the situation began to sink in. The doctors had caught the infection before it was too late. If I hadn't started throwing up, I might not have gone to the hospital when I did. Without that symptom finally forcing me to seek medical help, I probably would have continued ignoring the back pain and assuming it was nothing important. That thought still gives me chills. It's strange to think that something as unpleasant as vomiting may have been the very thing that saved my life. At the time, it felt like the worst part of the experience. Now I see it differently. It was a warning. It was my body's final attempt to tell me that something was seriously wrong. The scary part is that if that warning had come later, or if I had ignored it, the outcome could have been very different. Eventually, after 2 long weeks, I recovered enough to leave the hospital. Walking out felt amazing. I was grateful to be going home, grateful to be feeling better, and grateful that the doctors had been able to treat the infection before it became fatal. Years later, I still think about that experience from time to time. It's a reminder that serious medical problems don't always look the way we expect them to. Sometimes the signs are subtle. Sometimes they seem harmless. Sometimes a symptom that appears small can actually be your body trying to alert you to a much bigger problem. What started as a simple backache turned out to be a life-threatening kidney infection. And when I think about how close I came without realizing it, I can't help but wonder what might have happened if I had waited just a little longer. Thankfully, I never had to find out. I grew up in a loving family, and for most of my childhood, our home always felt safe. It was the kind of place where I never worried about strange noises in the middle of the night or felt afraid to walk around by myself. Nothing particularly unusual had ever happened there, which is why this experience has stayed with me for so many years. Even now, I still can't fully explain what happened that night. It started on an ordinary evening. I had stayed up much later than I normally would. Everyone else in the house had already gone to bed, and the entire place was quiet. The only sounds were the occasional creaks that old houses naturally make during the night. At some point, I checked the time and realized it was around 3 o'clock in the morning. I remember feeling tired, but not quite ready to sleep. After sitting awake for a while, I decided to get up and use the bathroom before finally going to bed. The hallway was dark as I walked there. The house felt different at that hour. During the daytime it was warm and familiar, but at 3 in the morning everything seemed strangely still. Every little sound felt amplified. I went into the bathroom, turned on the light, and closed the door most of the way behind me. I didn't bother shutting it completely. After finishing, I walked over to the sink and started washing my hands. That was when I heard it. At first, it was faint. Footsteps. I immediately froze and listened. The sound seemed to be coming from the kitchen. At first, I assumed one of my family members had gotten up for a glass of water or a late-night snack. That wouldn't have been unusual. But as I continued listening, something about the footsteps felt wrong. They were moving slowly, deliberately, step, step, step. The sound continued from the kitchen and began moving through the house, toward me. I stood completely still with the water running over my hands. The footsteps kept getting closer. For some reason, I expected them to stop somewhere in the hallway or turn into another room. Instead, they continued approaching the bathroom. My stomach tightened. The closer they got, the more uneasy I felt. The house was otherwise silent. No voices, no doors opening, no sounds that would identify who was walking around, just footsteps. Then they reached the bathroom. I remember staring toward the partially open door while trying to convince myself it was probably my father or my brother. The footsteps stopped directly outside, right in front of the doorway. The bathroom door wasn't fully closed. It was open enough that someone standing there could have easily looked inside, yet nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Whoever or whatever was outside simply stood there. I waited. A few seconds passed. Then, a few more. The silence became unbearable. Trying to break the tension, I quietly said, "Yes?" My voice sounded much smaller than I intended. There was no response, not a single word, not even a breath, nothing. For a moment, all I could hear was my own heartbeat. Then the footsteps started again. But instead of walking away toward another part of the house, they moved past the bathroom, directly toward my bedroom. I listened carefully. The reason I knew they entered my room was because of a particular section of flooring near the entrance. It always made a unique sound whenever someone stepped on it. Everyone in my family knew that sound. I heard it clearly. The footsteps entered my room. At that moment, confusion replaced some of my fear. Why would someone walk into my room without saying anything? And more importantly, who was it? I knew the way every member of my family walked. It might sound strange, but when you live with people for years, you become familiar with their footsteps. You learn their habits without even realizing it. These footsteps weren't familiar. I couldn't identify them. They didn't sound like my father. They didn't sound like my mother. They didn't sound like my brother. The realization sent a chill through me. I quickly looked around the bathroom for something I could use to protect myself. The only thing nearby was a can of hairspray. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I grabbed it tightly. Taking a deep breath, I slowly pushed the bathroom door open. My hands were shaking. I pointed the hairspray toward my bedroom as if it were some kind of weapon. Then I stepped into the hallway. The house was silent again. No movement, no voices, nothing. I cautiously approached my room. The closer I got, the more nervous I became. Every terrible possibility ran through my mind. What if someone had broken into the house? What if somebody was hiding in my room? What if they were waiting for me? My heart was pounding so hard that I could hear it. Finally, I reached the doorway. I looked inside. The room was empty. Completely empty. No person. No shadow. No movement. Nothing. I checked every corner. Under the desk. Near the closet. Beside the bed. There was absolutely nobody there. For a moment, I just stood there trying to process what had happened. I had clearly heard footsteps enter the room. I knew what I had heard, yet there was no one inside. Eventually, I convinced myself that maybe I had imagined it. Maybe I was tired. Maybe staying awake until 3 in the morning had caused my mind to play tricks on me. Wanting the whole experience to be over, I sat down on my bed and let out a long sigh. The relief lasted only a few seconds. Suddenly, there was a sharp knock on my window. My entire body locked up. I turned toward the sound immediately. Another knock. Not loud, not violent. Just enough to make it clear that something, or someone, was outside. The fear that hit me in that moment was unlike anything I had ever experienced before. My bedroom wasn't on the ground floor. There shouldn't have been anyone outside my window. I stared at the glass, expecting to see a face looking back at me, but I couldn't see anything. The darkness outside concealed everything. I sat frozen, barely breathing. My mind raced through every explanation I could think of. A tree branch? No, the weather was calm. An animal? Maybe, but the timing felt impossible. The knock had come immediately after the unexplained footsteps. The two events felt connected. The longer I sat there, the more frightened I became. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Eventually, I decided there was no chance I was spending the rest of the night in that room. I grabbed my blanket and quietly made my way downstairs. Instead of returning to my bedroom, I slept on the couch. At least there I felt closer to the rest of my family. Even then, sleep didn't come easily. Every little noise made me open my eyes. Every creak of the house made my heart race. I kept replaying the events in my mind. The footsteps coming from the kitchen. The way they walked directly to the bathroom. The silence outside the door. The footsteps entering my room. The empty bedroom. And finally, the knock on the window. What bothered me most was how strange the footsteps sounded. They weren't heavy enough to sound like a normal person walking through the house. At the same time, they were too noticeable to be an insect or some small creature. The closest description I can give is that they sounded like very light tiptoes, almost like someone or something was trying not to be heard. I know people often try to find logical explanations for stories like this, and I understand why, but I've spent years thinking about what happened. It couldn't have been my brother because his bedroom door had been shut. If he had left his room, I would have heard it open. It couldn't have been my father because he was asleep. My mother was asleep as well. Nobody in the house ever admitted to being awake at that hour. To this day, I still don't know what caused those footsteps. Maybe there is a perfectly reasonable explanation that I simply haven't figured out. Maybe exhaustion made me misinterpret ordinary sounds. Or maybe something happened that night that I will never fully understand. What I do know is how real it felt. I know what I heard. I know the fear I felt standing in that bathroom while those footsteps approached. And I know that years later, I can still remember every detail as clearly as if it happened yesterday. Thankfully, nothing ever came from it. No one was hurt. Nothing dangerous happened. By morning, everything seemed normal again. But even now, whenever I find myself awake at 3 in the morning and hear an unexpected sound somewhere in the house, my mind immediately goes back to that night. The night I heard footsteps walk from the kitchen to the bathroom, stop outside the door, enter my room, and then disappear without a trace. And to this day, I still have no idea what made those sounds. One of the creepiest experiences from my childhood happened when I was around 9 or 10 years old. Even now, years later, I still think about it from time to time and wonder what exactly I saw that night. At the time, I was staying at my grandmother's house in Poland. It was an old house with a lot of history behind it. While it was a comfortable place during the day, it felt completely different once the sun went down. The floors creaked constantly, the walls made strange noises, and there always seemed to be sounds coming from somewhere in the house. As a kid, it was the kind of place that could make your imagination run wild. One evening, my parents and my grandmother decided to go shopping. It wasn't anything unusual, and they planned to be back later that night. That left me and my older sister at home by ourselves. My sister was 13 at the time and wasn't worried about being alone. She was downstairs in the living room watching television while I was doing my own thing around the house. By the time this happened, it was already after 9 o'clock at night. Outside, the darkness had completely settled in. The backyard behind the house was difficult to see, and the only light came from a few distant streetlights and the glow from the windows. At some point, I realized I needed to use the bathroom. The bathroom was upstairs, so I headed toward the staircase. Even before I reached the top, I remember feeling slightly uneasy. The upper floor always felt creepier than the rest of the house, especially at night. Every step on the staircase produced a loud creak, and each sound seemed much louder when nobody else was nearby. When I reached the bathroom, I reached for the light switch. Nothing happened. I tried it again. Still nothing. The light wasn't working. That wasn't entirely surprising, because the house was old, and things occasionally stopped working without warning. Still, standing in a dark upstairs hallway as a child wasn't exactly a comforting experience. Not wanting to walk around in complete darkness, I borrowed my sister's phone and used the flashlight. The small beam of light illuminated the hallway just enough for me to see where I was going. I entered the bathroom and shut the door most of the way behind me. The flashlight cast strange shadows across the walls, making the room feel much different than it did during the daytime. As I stood there, I happened to glance toward the window. The bathroom window overlooked the backyard. At first, I wasn't really looking for anything. It was just a casual glance outside. Then I froze. Standing in the backyard was something I couldn't explain. At least, that's what it looked like to me. I could have sworn there was a figure standing there. Not a person I recognized. Not a neighbor. Not a family member. Just a tall, completely black figure. It was darker than the night around it, almost as if it were absorbing the darkness itself. What frightened me the most wasn't its height or the fact that it was standing perfectly still. It was its eyes. Two bright red eyes stared directly toward the window. Directly at me. For a moment, I couldn't move. I just stood there, staring back. My heart immediately began pounding in my chest. The figure didn't seem to move. It simply stood there in the backyard. Watching, the longer I looked at it, the more terrified I became. I remember feeling a rush of panic shoot through my entire body. At that age, there was no way I was going to stay there and investigate. The second my brain processed what I thought I was seeing, my survival instincts took over. I turned and ran. I burst out of the bathroom and sprinted toward the staircase as fast as I could. Every creak of the floorboards seemed louder than ever as I raced across the upper floor. I practically jumped down the stairs in my hurry to get away. When I reached the living room, I immediately started telling my sister what I had seen. I was out of breath and completely panicked. I told her there was something in the backyard. Something tall. Something with red eyes. Something staring directly at me through the bathroom window. Like most older siblings, she didn't seem nearly as convinced as I was. Whether she thought I had imagined it or simply didn't believe me, I can't remember exactly. What I do remember is the overwhelming fear I felt. No matter what anyone said, I knew what I thought I had seen. The rest of the evening felt different after that. Every little sound made me jump. Every shadow seemed suspicious. The old house suddenly felt much larger and much darker than before. Eventually, My parents and grandmother returned home. I felt safer once they were back, but the fear didn't completely disappear. When it came time to go to bed, I found myself replaying the image over and over in my head. That dark figure, those red eyes, the way it seemed to be staring directly at me. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every creak in the house made me open my eyes. Every little noise felt significant. The house had always made sounds at night, but after what I had seen, those sounds seemed far more unsettling. I remember lying in bed listening. The floorboards creaked. The walls popped. Occasional noises echoed through the old structure. Normally, those sounds could be explained by an aging house settling during the night. But as a frightened child, every sound felt like evidence that something was moving around, something I couldn't see. Hours seemed to pass before I finally drifted off to sleep. Even after all these years, I still think about that night. Part of me understands that I was a child, and that there could be many logical explanations. The darkness could have distorted my vision. The shape might have been a tree, a shadow, or something else in the yard that looked different in the limited light. Fear and imagination can sometimes turn ordinary things into terrifying ones, but another part of me isn't completely convinced. The memory feels incredibly real. I can still picture the backyard exactly as it looked through that bathroom window. I can still remember the shock of seeing what appeared to be a tall black figure standing there. And I can still remember those red eyes staring back at me. Whether it was my imagination, a trick of the darkness, or something I still can't explain, it remains one of the most unsettling memories from my childhood. To this day, whenever I find myself in an old house at night and hear floorboards creaking somewhere in the darkness, I think back to that evening in Poland. And for just a moment, I remember the feeling of standing in that bathroom window, looking out into the backyard and wondering what exactly was staring back at me. When I was somewhere between 6 and 9 years old, my parents both worked night shifts. Because they were gone for most of the night, my older sister and I would stay at my aunt's house almost every day. My sister was around 15 at the time, so my aunt's place basically became our second home. Honestly, I loved being there. My cousins and I would spend hours playing games, running around the house, and finding ways to entertain ourselves. We played hide and seek, watched movies, told jokes, and laughed until our stomachs hurt. During the day, it was one of my favorite places in the world. But everything changed when night came. For some reason, the house always felt different after dark. Part of it was probably because my cousins and sister loved telling scary stories. They would try to scare each other for fun, and since I was the youngest, I was usually the easiest target. Being a little kid, I believed almost everything they told me. If they said a ghost lived in the hallway, I believed it. If they said there was a monster outside the window, I believed that too. By the time bedtime arrived, my imagination would already be working overtime. Still, every night followed the same routine. We would get ready for bed, say goodnight, and settle into our sleeping spots. Eventually, I would drift off to sleep. Then, something strange would happen. Almost every time I stayed there, I would suddenly wake up in the middle of the night. It was usually around 2 or 3 in the morning. I never checked the exact time, but it was always deep into the night when the house was completely silent. At first, I thought it was normal. People wake up during the night sometimes. But what happened after I woke up was what terrified me. Every time I opened my eyes, I would see a girl standing in the room. Not just any girl. She looked almost exactly like the girl from the horror movie The Ring. She had long black hair hanging down over her face, covering most of her features. She wore what looked like a white dress, and she would simply stand there in the darkness. Watching, the first time it happened, I thought I was dreaming. I blinked several times. The figure remained. I rubbed my eyes and pulled the blanket away from my face. She was still there. The room was quiet, except for the faint sound of the television. That's another detail I remember clearly. Whenever I woke up, the TV would be on, not on a specific channel, just some random late-night channel playing in the background. The flickering light from the screen would cast shadows throughout the room, making everything feel even more surreal. Then I would look across the room, and there she would be, standing completely still. At first, I was too frightened to move. I would just stare at her. My heart would pound so hard that I could hear it in my ears. I kept expecting her to disappear. I kept telling myself that I was imagining things, but every time I checked again, she was still there. Night after night, week after week, year after year. What makes the memory so strange is how normal it eventually became. As terrifying as it sounds, after seeing her so many times, I slowly became less shocked by her presence. I never became comfortable with it, but I wasn't always frozen with fear. Sometimes I would simply wake up, see her standing there, and stare back, as if it had become part of my nightly routine. Looking back, that seems even stranger than the sight itself. One particular night stands out in my memory more than all the others. I woke up like usual. The room was dark, except for the glow from the television. The girl was standing in her usual spot. Her long black hair covered her face. She wasn't moving. She wasn't making a sound. She was simply there. For some reason, instead of hiding under my blanket or trying to go back to sleep, I decided to speak to her. Maybe I was tired of being scared. Maybe I was curious. Or maybe I had seen her so many times that I wanted answers. In a shaky voice, I asked a simple question. "Are you real?" The words barely left my mouth. For a moment, nothing happened. The room remained silent. Then I could have sworn I saw her move. Very slowly, very slightly, as if she was nodding her head. No, that was the answer I thought she gave me. No. I remember immediately pulling the blanket over my head after that. Whether she actually moved, or whether my frightened imagination convinced me she did, I honestly don't know. But at the time, it felt completely real. The strange encounters continued for years. Every time I stayed at my aunt's house, I expected to see her, and most of the time, I did. The experience became such a normal part of my childhood that I almost stopped questioning it. I simply accepted that somewhere around 2 or 3 in the morning, I might wake up and find the mysterious girl standing in the room. What made it even more confusing was that she never seemed threatening. She never rushed toward me. She never screamed. She never tried to harm me. She just stood there, silent, motionless. Watching that somehow made the experience even creepier. If something attacks you, at least you understand its intent. But when something simply stands there and stares at you without explanation, your imagination fills in all the blanks. As the years passed, I got older. Eventually, I reached the age of 10. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. One night I woke up, and she wasn't there. The next night, nothing happened. Then, another night passed. And another. Weeks went by. Months went by. The girl never returned. I never saw her again. There was no dramatic ending, no explanation, no final encounter. She simply vanished from my life. Looking back now, I honestly don't know what to think. Part of me wonders if it was all in my imagination. Children can experience vivid dreams, sleep-related hallucinations, and all sorts of things that feel completely real at the time. Maybe that's what happened. Maybe I was caught somewhere between sleeping and waking, and my brain created the same image over and over again. That would certainly explain why the experiences stopped as I got older. But another part of me isn't entirely convinced. The memories feel so vivid, so detailed. I can still picture the room, the glow of the television, the silence of the house, and the dark-haired girl standing motionless in the corner. Even now, years later, I can remember those nights as clearly as if they happened yesterday. Whatever the explanation may be, those experiences remain some of the strangest memories from my childhood. Maybe it was imagination. Maybe it was a recurring dream. Maybe it was something else entirely. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that for what felt like years, almost every time I stayed at my aunt's house, I would wake up in the middle of the night and see the same girl standing there in the darkness. And just as mysteriously as she appeared, she disappeared forever when I turned 10. To this day, I still find myself wondering what exactly I was seeing all those years ago. One of the strangest experiences from my childhood happened at my cousin's house, and even now I'm not entirely sure what I saw that night. My cousin is only a few months older than me, so growing up, we spent a lot of time together. We were very close and often had sleepovers at each other's houses. One particular thing about her always stood out to me. She had an imaginary friend. According to her, this friend had been with her since she was very young. I can't remember the name anymore. It might have been Valera or maybe Gosha. The exact name has faded from my memory over the years, but that part isn't really important. What I do remember is how seriously she believed in him. She talked about him as if he were a real person. She would tell me stories about how they played together, how he visited her, and how he had been her companion for as long as she could remember. The strange thing was that she never seemed to outgrow him. Even as she got older, she continued talking about him as though he was still around. She genuinely cared about him. As a child, I was fascinated by the idea. Part of me was curious, and part of me wanted to see him for myself. Whenever I stayed at her house, I would ask questions about him. Sometimes I would even try to call out to him, hoping he would appear. There were nights when I stayed awake longer than I should have, secretly waiting to see if this mysterious friend would show himself. But nothing ever happened. No matter how hard I looked or how long I waited, I never saw anyone. Eventually, I started to assume that he really was just an imaginary friend. After all, children often invent companions. It didn't seem that unusual. Years passed. By the time the experience I'm about to describe happened, I was around 10 or 11 years old. Once again, I was spending the night at my cousin's house. Everything about the evening felt completely normal. We talked, watched television, laughed about random things, and eventually got ready for bed. The house itself had a layout that I still remember clearly. My cousin's bedroom was fairly large. When you stepped out of her room, there was a living room directly to the left. To the right was the kitchen and a hallway leading farther into the apartment. The bathroom was located down that hallway. One detail that always felt slightly inconvenient was that the bathroom light switch wasn't actually inside the bathroom. It was mounted on the wall outside, near the entrance. Late that night, after everyone had gone to sleep, I woke up needing to use the bathroom. The apartment was completely quiet. The kind of quiet that only exists in the middle of the night. I carefully climbed out of bed, trying not to wake my cousin. The hallway beyond her room was dark. Only faint moonlight coming through the windows provided enough light to make out shapes and outlines. Still half asleep, I stepped out of the bedroom and started walking toward the bathroom. Everything seemed normal. I reached the hallway and extended my hand toward the light switch. As I turned it on, light spilled into the corridor. And that's when I saw it. For a split second, I froze. There was a figure standing in the kitchen. At first, my brain struggled to process what I was looking at. The figure appeared tall, much taller than anyone I knew. It looked like a man, or at least something that resembled one. The strangest part was its silhouette. The shape seemed to be wearing a long on its head was something that looked like a hat. Even now, years later, that's the image I remember most clearly. A tall figure, a coat, a hat, standing silently in the kitchen. At first, I couldn't move. I simply stared. My heart immediately began beating faster. The apartment was supposed to be empty except for my cousin and the adults sleeping in their rooms. Nobody should have been standing there, especially not in the middle of the night. For a few terrifying moments, I remained completely still. Then, something happened that made my fear even worse. The figure turned toward me. I don't know how else to describe it. One moment, it was facing away. The next moment, it seemed aware of my presence, as if it had noticed me standing in the hallway, as if it was looking directly at me. A cold wave of fear rushed through my body. Every instinct told me to run, but I was too frightened to take my eyes off it. Instead, I slowly began backing away, one step at a time. I kept staring at the figure. I didn't want to lose sight of it. I was afraid that if I looked away, something worse might happen. The figure remained where it was. Silent, motionless, watching, I continued moving backward until I reached the corner leading back to my cousin's room. The moment I turned that corner, my fear completely took over. I spun around and hurried back into the bedroom as quickly as I could. I shut the door firmly behind me. My hands were shaking. At that point, I had completely forgotten why I had gotten out of bed in the first place. The bathroom was the last thing on my mind. All I wanted was to be back in a room that felt safe. I climbed into bed and pulled the blanket over myself. I didn't tell my cousin what had happened. I didn't wake anyone. I simply lay there trying to convince myself that everything was fine. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I fell asleep. The next morning, life continued as normal. No one mentioned anything unusual. There were no signs that someone had been in the kitchen. No explanation for what I had seen. As time passed, I kept the experience to myself. Days turned into months. Months turned into years. I never told anyone. Part of me worried that people would laugh or assume I had imagined it. Another part of me wasn't even sure how to explain it. What had I actually seen? A shadow? A trick of the light? A dream that somehow blended into reality? I didn't know. Then, about 2 years later, I finally told my cousin. I expected her to dismiss it. Instead, I found myself thinking about the stories she used to tell me as children. The stories about her mysterious friend who had supposedly been with her since childhood. The friend I had spent years trying to see. The friend who never appeared. At least, not until that night. Even now, I don't know what stood in that kitchen. Maybe it was nothing more than my imagination. Maybe the darkness and the sudden light created an illusion. Maybe my sleepy mind misinterpreted an ordinary object as a person. Those explanations are certainly possible. But whenever I remember the experience, I find myself thinking about my cousin's stories. And one thing remains clear. I don't believe what I saw that night was her imaginary friend. Whatever was standing in that kitchen felt like something entirely different, something far stranger. And to this day, I still don't know what it was. For a moment, my father couldn't believe what he was seeing. The description matched the local legend perfectly. Every detail, the red dress, the candle, the lonely figure standing beside the bridge in the middle of the night. The joking inside the car stopped. Fear quickly replaced amusement. What had seemed like a ridiculous rumor only minutes earlier now felt disturbingly real. My father later said that something about the woman felt wrong. It wasn't just her appearance. It was the way she stood completely still, the way she seemed untouched by the darkness around her. the way she appeared to be waiting. Watching, the car continued moving toward the bridge. As the distance between them and the woman decreased, panic began to set in. My father immediately remembered the warning attached to the legend. Do not look at her face. Without wasting any time, he turned to his friends and shouted for everyone to close their eyes. His voice was so serious that nobody argued, nobody laughed, nobody questioned him. The fear in his tone was enough. One by one, his friends squeezed their eyes shut. My father did the same. The only exception was the driver. Obviously, the driver couldn't close his eyes while crossing a bridge. But according to my father, luck was on their side. The woman was standing on the opposite side of the bridge from where the driver was seated. Because of the position of the vehicle and the angle of the road, the driver never had a clear view of her. He continued focusing on the road ahead. Meanwhile, everyone else kept their eyes tightly closed. The atmosphere inside the car became tense and silent. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. All they wanted was to get across the bridge as quickly as possible. The seconds felt like minutes. Every bump in the road seemed magnified. Every sound from the car felt unnaturally loud. Eventually, they reached the other side. The bridge was behind them. The driver continued forward. After a while, my father slowly opened his eyes. The woman was gone. There was nothing behind them except darkness. No red dress. No candle. No figure standing on the bridge. Just an empty road disappearing into the night. Relief washed over everyone in the car. Nobody wanted to talk about what they had seen. The experience had shaken them more than they wanted to admit. What disturbed them most wasn't simply seeing a woman on a bridge. People stand on bridges all the time. What frightened them was how perfectly she matched the description that had been passed down through local stories for years. Every detail was exactly the same. As they continued their journey home, the conversation remained quiet. The earlier laughter was gone. The confidence that the legend was merely a rumor had disappeared. By the time they finally reached home safely, everyone was grateful that nothing bad had happened. Life eventually moved on. The college interview became a distant memory. The friends grew older, years passed. But the memory of that night never completely left my father. Even today, whenever the story comes up, he still wonders about it. He often thinks about how close they came to the woman on the bridge, and sometimes he asks himself a question that still sends a chill down his spine. What would have happened if they had looked directly at her face? Would nothing have happened at all? Would they have discovered that it was merely an ordinary person standing there? Or would the old stories have proven true? Nobody in that car ever found out. And perhaps that uncertainty is what makes the memory so unsettling. To this day, my father remains thankful that they crossed the bridge safely and returned home without incident. But even after all these years, the image of a woman in a red dress holding a candle in the darkness remains one of the most frightening memories of his life. And every time he tells the story, he still wonders what might have happened if they had dared to look. This story wasn't something I experienced myself. It was told to me by my father, and even though many years have passed since it happened, he still remembers that night vividly. Whenever he talks about it, there is always a seriousness in his voice that makes it clear he has never completely forgotten what he saw. The story goes back to his college days. At the time, my father and 4 of his friends had traveled to another city for a college interview. They were young, excited about their future, and focused on getting into a good college. The trip itself was fairly ordinary. They attended the interview, spent the day in the city, and eventually began preparing for the journey home. By the time they started heading back, it was already late in the evening. The roads were mostly empty, and darkness had settled over the countryside. The only light came from their car's headlights, and the occasional street lamp along the route. The 5 friends were in good spirits. They talked about the interview, joked with each other, and discussed what they would do if they were accepted. Like most young people, they were more interested in their future than in old ghost stories and local legends. However, there was one thing about their route home that everyone knew about. At some point during the journey, they would have to cross an old bridge. That bridge had a reputation. For years, local people had shared stories about a mysterious woman who supposedly appeared there at night. According to the legend, she wore a red dress and carried a lit candle in her hand. The details of the story varied depending on who was telling it, but one part always remained the same. People claimed that if you looked directly at her face, disaster would follow. Some versions said drivers would immediately lose control of their vehicles. Others claimed that anyone who locked eyes with her would be involved in a fatal accident before leaving the bridge. Most people dismissed the story as nothing more than a superstition. My father and his friends certainly did. As they approached the bridge that night, they joked about the legend. They laughed about how many ghost stories seemed to exist around old roads and abandoned places. None of them actually expected to see anything. The driver continued forward without concern. The bridge slowly came into view ahead of them. Everything seemed normal. The night was quiet. The road was empty. Then, something changed. As the car drew closer to the bridge, my father noticed something standing in the distance. At first, it was only a faint shape. A figure, motionless, standing near the side of the bridge. My father narrowed his eyes and looked more carefully. The closer they got, the clearer the figure became. His heart immediately began to race. The stories suddenly came rushing back into his mind. Standing near the bridge was a woman. She was dressed entirely in red, and in her hand was a candle. The small flame flickered in the darkness. For a moment, my father couldn't believe what he was seeing. The description matched the local legend perfectly. Every detail: the red dress, the candle, the lonely figure standing beside the bridge in the middle of the night. The joking inside the car stopped. Fear quickly replaced amusement. What had seemed like a ridiculous rumor only minutes earlier now felt disturbingly real. My father later said that something about the woman felt wrong. It wasn't just her appearance. It was the way she stood completely still, the way she seemed untouched by the darkness around her, the way she appeared to be waiting. Watching, the car continued moving toward the bridge. As the distance between them and the woman decreased, panic began to set in. My father immediately remembered the warning attached to the legend. Do not look at her face. Without wasting any time, he turned to his friends and shouted for everyone to close their eyes. His voice was so serious that nobody argued. Nobody laughed. Nobody questioned him. The fear in his tone was enough. One by one, his friends squeezed their eyes shut. My father did the same. The only exception was the driver. Obviously, the driver couldn't close his eyes while crossing a bridge. But according to my father, luck was on their side. The woman was standing on the opposite side of the bridge from where the driver was seated. Because of the position of the vehicle and the angle of the road, the driver never had a clear view of her. He continued focusing on the road ahead. Meanwhile, everyone else kept their eyes tightly closed. The atmosphere inside the car became tense and silent. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. All they wanted was to get across the bridge as quickly as possible. The seconds felt like minutes. Every bump in the road seemed magnified. Every sound from the car felt unnaturally loud. Eventually, they reached the other side. The bridge was behind them. The driver continued forward. After a while, my father slowly opened his eyes. The woman was gone. There was nothing behind them except darkness. No red dress, no candle, No figure standing on the bridge, just an empty road disappearing into the night. Relief washed over everyone in the car. Nobody wanted to talk about what they had seen. The experience had shaken them more than they wanted to admit. What disturbed them most wasn't simply seeing a woman on a bridge. People stand on bridges all the time. What frightened them was how perfectly she matched the description that had been passed down through local stories for years. Every detail was exactly the same. As they continued their journey home, the conversation remained quiet. The earlier laughter was gone. The confidence that the legend was merely a rumor had disappeared. By the time they finally reached home safely, everyone was grateful that nothing bad had happened. Life eventually moved on. The college interview became a distant memory. The friends grew older. Years passed. But the memory of that night never completely left my father. Even today, whenever the story comes up, he still wonders about it. He often thinks about how close they came to the woman on the bridge, and sometimes he asks himself a question that still sends a chill down his spine. What would have happened if they had looked directly at her face? Would nothing have happened at all? Would they have discovered that it was merely an ordinary person standing there? Or would the old stories have proven true? Nobody in that car ever found out, and perhaps that uncertainty is what makes the memory so unsettling. To this day, my father remains thankful that they crossed the bridge safely and returned home without incident. But even after all these years, the image of a woman in a red dress holding a candle in the darkness remains one of the most frightening memories of his life. And every time he tells the story, he still wonders what might have happened if they had dared to look.